You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and Campus Killings. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking. Hey everyone, this is Mike Morford with a new episode of Zodiac Speaking, and we have a special guest here, Ned DeHaan from Black Box Radio is here. We're going to talk some Lake Herman Road. It's the anniversary here since the crime happened. It's been, my math is terrible. What is it? 56 years? Yeah, 56 years. So a somber anniversary, and just a shout out to my co-host Rich. He's not able to join us because he's under the weather, so I'm hoping he's feeling better here during the holidays, but we didn't want to miss this opportunity to talk about this segment of the Zodiac mystery, in particular with the anniversary here. So Ned, as always, I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mork. And my name is Ned DeHaan. I'm the host of Black Box Online Radio. Every Monday, I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer called just that, Zodiac Monday. And it's great to be back on Zodiac Speaking.
Yeah, it's always good to pick your brain. And, we've had you on, we've had Drew Gray on, and, it's always good to have different guests so we can get their input for different segments of this Zodiac mystery. But today, this is an important one because this is the first confirmed crime. Lake Herman Road, December 20th, 1968, is the first confirmed Zodiac murderers. And some people probably out there will say, no, it wasn't really the Zodiac, but, maybe we can incorporate that little theory into the conversation. But what is your overall take on the Lake Herman Road portion of the mystery? What things have you thought about or talked about that really jump out to you about this particular crime scene?
I think that it's easiest to start from the beginning and go through all the different things that I've thought about over the years, as opposed to just simply saying what I think now. For example, when I first learned about the Zodiac Killer, you learn about the dates of Zodiac Killer activity. You learned that December 20th of 1968 was the day that David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered at Lake Herman Road, which is a parking lot or turnoff that has, it's nearby the entrance to the Benicia water pumping station in California. And when people hear Lake Herman Road, like even me, I immediately visualized it as being somewhat lakeside like Lake Berryessa. But it appears that that is untrue. This is like a gravel turnoff that is, again, by a road that goes to the water pumping station that has a gate on it. And I just accepted that it was the Zodiac Killer. And because it's listed as the first date in Zodiac Killer activity, and over the years, I found all of these alternative things that people had been thinking about with the Lake Herman Road murders, that people had been saying about with the Lake Herman Road murders. And one of the first ones that really challenged a lot of my initial beliefs about the Zodiac Killer was the drug-related angle. Because there's a story that the male victim at Lake Herman Road, David Faraday, was involved in a confrontation with a local drug dealer or drug pusher. Somebody was dealing weed at his high school, and he was very anti-drug. He was a clean-cut guy. He was an Eagle Scout. And if I recall, he was the lodge chief of the Order of the Arrow, of his Order of the Arrow Lodge. And he's a member of the community, and he's also someone who is rather outspoken, and he wasn't afraid of confrontation. That's another point that I recall from David Faraday. And even though he has this reputation for being clean cut, it seems like he was someone who could hold his own, because David was also a very accomplished wrestler. And then there's this idea that David was going to rat on somebody for selling drugs, which, as I understand, would have been marijuana. And then other people thought that if he rats on that person might rat on somebody else, a more high ranking member of the drug trade. So then David Faraday was murdered to be silenced. That was just the easiest way for everybody involved with the drug scene in the Vallejo and Benicia area to just fix the problem, to get rid of David Faraday, who just happened to be with Betty Lou Jensen. And I really looked at that possibility for a long time. But one of the things that people don't seem to get about Black Box Online Radio and Zodiac Monday is these are unsolved cases. It's not like I have all the answers. And when I read somebody else's book and they lay out their theory, I also don't just say, hey, this person has all the answers. I now agree with this person. You are trying to evaluate the information. You're looking at what other people have to say. Maybe somebody has an insight that you haven't considered before. Maybe somebody is trying to connect the dots in a different way. And there is another theory out there that's been given a lot of consideration recently, and that is that there were local criminals in the area that were committing crimes that were almost somewhat motiveless. And there was a group of individuals that were more or less just committing local crimes like robberies, and they may have even committed a, a similar style shooting, and they may have just murdered David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen because of lousy circumstances, because of rotten luck and rotten timing for David and Betty Lou. But then there is the theory that I ultimately do agree with, but I do have to side with, and the one that I think I am going to stand by, and that is just that this was the Zodiac killer, that this was the Zodiac killer's first confirmed crime, and that somebody either went out to commit murder, or maybe it was something that triggered him that night, and that this single serial killer was driving around California, and he came up to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen at Lake Herman Road, and he shot them with a .22 caliber firearm. And to this day, we are still uncertain whether it was a rifle or a pistol. I think it was a .22 caliber pistol, and that he exited the car, he fired a warning shot, and then he walked around to the driver's side, and then David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen got very scared, and Betty Lou started shouting at David, "Let's go, let's run, he has a gun." So they both exited the passenger side door, and then the Zodiac could have easily walked around in that time, held them up at gunpoint, shot David Faraday in the head. Betty Lou had flight instincts once again, and she just started running. The Zodiac killer panicked, and this would have happened within the time frame of 2 seconds, maybe 1 second. And he just started firing bullets at Betty Lou Jensen, but he could see her because he had a pencil flashlight taped to the gun barrel. So he could see Betty Lou's body. He shot her multiple times, and she fell to the ground, and she died almost instantly. Even though David Faraday was shot in the head, he survived longer. Like he passed away after Betty Lou, if I recall the times of death. But then you asked about what I was thinking, and I had a big reversal on the Lake Herman Road murders earlier this year, particularly when I read the book Killing for Sport by Pat Brown, which talked about how with serial killer, perhaps the first crime is one that is going to be completely unplanned. And then the second crime is done to recreate the first crime. That would be the Zodiac's Blue Rock Springs shooting, is done to see, hey, can I do this again? Maybe I can commit the same murder and not get caught again. After that, then the killer tries to develop a persona and some type of pattern of behaviors. And we see that with the Zodiac killer's Lake Berryessa stabbing. So those are some of the thoughts that I've had, but there are a lot more we can go through. And I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Yeah, so I mean, those are all good points. So, one thing you mentioned Zodiac had a pen light. He claims he did anyway, if we take him for his word, but that is a dark area. There's not good lighting out there. So it's safe to say that he probably had some kind of light. Although, if I recall, the moon was pretty bright that night. So maybe it just was enough of it lit up the area enough where he could see. But what's interesting about the whole crime scene in general is we have this timeline of 6 minutes. The police reports, they have down to the minute where the last witness, James Owen, sees Dave's car and a car next to it, presumably Zodiac's. And then the lady that finds the car, Stella, comes along 6 minutes later and finds nobody around and two bodies on the ground. So we have this very tight window. And to the police credit, they weren't used to dealing with murders like this there in Vallejo, not of this kind. And they did a good job with all the witnesses, getting them to check their clocks to see how close they were. Because if one person said, well, I drove by that scene at 11 o'clock, and the other person says 11:10, they wanted to see if any of their clocks were off one way or the other. And they did adjust for some times that were off on people's clocks to narrow down and get that 6 minute window. So kudos to them for doing that. But then you've got the 6 minute window where, James Owen is the last witness to see Dave's car and presumably a car next to it that we presume was Zodiac's. But, one thing that always interested me is, I was the first time I read about that case, obviously in great detail, was in Robert Graysmith's book, Zodiac. And it wasn't until I got the police reports that I was reading through the police reports, and I love reading through police reports. I'm looking at that report, and they're talking about James Owen and the times that he's there. And Robert Graysmith reported that he was coming home that night after his shift, when he was actually going to work that night to his shift, when he saw that second car. And then what happened was he came back by the next morning after he finished that midnight shift and was driving by the crime scene and pulled over to assist officers. So, it was interesting. I found out I was the one that realized Graysmith had got that wrong in his book, and he had it backwards. And so, that told me a couple things, about James Owen's route and timing. But what jumped out to me, and then I actually considered James Owen suspicious for a little while, because he's at the crime scene where there's presumably chalk outlines of the bodies and stuff there. And it's hours after the crime. He's saying what he knows, but he doesn't mention anything about a gunshot, which is, to me, if you're there hours after you drove by and you don't say anything about a gunshot, but then 3 days later he's questioned again and he remembers this time hearing a gunshot a quarter mile past the scene, that's a big problem, because it doesn't seem like something you would forget hours after you're there, but a few days later you're going to suddenly remember that. And it also presents another problem, because James Owen, when he drives by, glances over at the cars, doesn't see any people in or around the cars. So we don't know if he's telling the truth. We don't know where Dave and Betty were, where the Zodiac was. They could all have been laying down in the car. They could have been outside of the car, hiding somewhere, but James Owen didn't see him. And then quarter mile up the road, he, in the second story, he says that he thought he heard a gunshot. And if that's Zodiac shooting, I calculated that one time, I think it was 13 seconds or so. How does he hear a gunshot when 13 seconds before there was nobody in sight around those cars? So to me, it's like wherever everybody was hiding would have to run out and scramble to get in position to be where they were found, and hear that gunshot 13 seconds later. So to me, I always had some suspicion of James Owen, placing him there as the last person to be there before the bodies were found. I always thought he was a little bit suspicious for that. Now, I interviewed him and spoke with him, and he did say, a couple interesting things. One was that I asked him how well he knew the area around Vallejo and that area, and did he drive around? And I'll never forget these words to me. He said, "I never did cruise around the area." So as soon as he said that, I mean, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because it was directly something that Zodiac had said. And then later on, he sort of downplayed the danger. He had teenage kids that were, the Zodiac's target age range. And I asked him, I said, "Hey, when these Zodiac killings were going on, were you ever nervous for your kids?" And he says, "Nah, it was no big deal." And I always thought that was weird. So I had this little bit of suspicion about him, but the more I looked at him, the more I tended to rule him out. He was a military guy, had a good, clean record, never been in trouble. He was 6'3", which is, well over the estimates of Zodiac. He didn't look like the composite sketches. I had handwriting from him that was cursive, not printed, but it didn't look like Zodiac's. So in my mind, I had ruled him out, but the police questioned him at least twice and made him redrive the route that he had taken that night, just to make sure they got his story straight. And I don't know if that's because maybe they suspected him a little bit too, or they really just wanted to narrow down what he was telling them. But I always found his part of the story interesting, because he's the only one we know, from his own words, is there minutes before Stella Borges finds those bodies. And we're going by everything he says. We have no other witness to guide us other than him. So if he's telling the truth and he saw what he says he did, that's what we've been going by. Now, another interesting thing, Stella comes along 6 minutes later. James Owen is gone by this time. The car that's parked there is gone. And you have these two bodies laying on the ground. And she specifically sees Betty Lou Jensen laying on her side. So she runs off and gets help. And when she comes back, when she summons help and comes back with the Benicia police department that she was able to find, they come back to the scene. Betty Lou has died by this point and has turned over and fell off of her side. And I forget, was she on her front or her back, whatever it was. She had fallen over onto this front side and was no longer on her side, which is how Stella found her when she happened upon the scene. When Zodiac later on mailed that letter, he said she was on her side when he left. So that's interesting to me. That tells me that he was really there because he knew that she was on her side, when later, photos and reports and stuff show her laying flat and not on her side. It matches what Stella said. So to me, he either was there and was telling the truth, or he had to have written Stella Borges, had read Stella Borges' account of what she saw to match up. To me, it just seems obvious that he was there at the scene. When he left, he was right. Betty was on her side. Just like, a minute later when Stella found her, she was on her side. And then later on, when the police arrived, she's now laying flat, because I think she had expired and just rolled over a little bit and died. So those were some of the interesting tidbits that I, have always thought about with this case. And in particular, that 6-minute window, what James Owen saw when he arrived versus what Stella Borges saw when she arrived.
I mean, that definitely is like some very interesting stuff, but this is really what I think zones in on how the evidence does seem to move toward a single perpetrator, and just how there was one Zodiac who was actually telling the truth about being at Lake Herman Road and his movements. Now, there are a couple points there that you brought up, Morph, that I think we should discuss. And one of them is that there's this witness who did not say that he heard a gunshot and then changed the story later on, saying that he did hear a gunshot. And I've just noticed that time and time again, that witnesses change their stories in a lot of different true crime cases, even outside of the Zodiac killer mystery. And I mean, we even have people who are not maybe witnesses directly to the crime scenes, but people who are personally involved in these stories, changing their things or just saying very suspicious things out of context. For example, Jim Phillips Crabtree, the husband of Darlene Ferrin, her ex-husband, went on a documentary called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer in 2023 and said that he was a cryptographer in the army and he told his ex-wife Darlene Ferrin that hell would come to her 9 times over, and there were 9 shots fired at the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And he's inserting these things that are almost making himself look suspicious. And to the credit of Andrew Knox's documentary, they tried to show that a lot of the things he was saying were questionable and they expressed doubts. And it's almost as if this person is just making up the story to be part of the situation. And this happens time and time again. And is something that is so unbelievably frustrating because it's like if people were to stick to what they've actually experienced and what they've actually heard and what they've actually seen, as opposed to enjoying the center of the spotlight for a moment, or maybe even if it's done in a less conniving way, they are just getting their memories influenced by outside sources, and then they start believing things that they are untrue. So sometimes it's calculated and sometimes it's uncalculated, but witnesses change their stories all the time. And we're going to see this multiple times in the Zodiac Killer mystery. And I mean, we can even look at William Crowe, someone whom we haven't mentioned yet. And he was the person who was driving a sports car to the Lake Herman Road turnoff. And the big thing that he is famous for is that he claims he pulled the sports car into the parking lot. And if I recall, the sports car was owned by his girlfriend's father, and she was in the passenger seat. And then he got out to tinker with the motor because I don't really think there would have been anything wrong with the new sports car. My honest answer is I think he wanted to just have a look and play around with it because he had a chance to drive a new sports car. And then this suspicious vehicle pulled in to the parking lot and he was bothered by it. So he got back in and he drove away, and he believed that this suspicious vehicle that may have had 2 men in it, maybe 1 or maybe 2, drove away, but he would go back and forth on his story. Although, I mean, people will debate and argue about that, but that's just another example of a witness who was giving wavering responses and being inconsistent with his witness statements. And I do think that the whole thing is a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, we do see it time and time again, and that's why I'm a fan. I'll always say to go with the freshest memory that happened right afterwards before their mind has a chance to change things and adjust things and, play tricks on them and make things that weren't there. Whether it's James Owens suddenly remembering a gunshot when he didn't say it the first time around, or it's some of this stuff that's said in documentaries years after the fact that they didn't say at the time. You look at Mike Mageau's description and exactly what he said as soon as he could talk to the police, and it's wildly different from what he says 50 years later. You look at somebody like Officer Collins from Napa, who never put one mention of Cecilia telling him how tall Zodiac was in a report. And here he is 50 years later in this documentary saying, well, Cecilia said this and she said that. And meanwhile, he had never documented that before at the time. So I don't trust people that, way after the fact, start changing things, adjusting things that don't line up with the early truth, because I think people, their minds play tricks on them. I don't necessarily think they're lying, but they'll start to change things, add things that weren't there, second guess themselves. I think we can even see this with the Robbins kids. I mean, they made a sketch and then the kids thought about it and thought, okay, well, this sketch doesn't look old enough. I think he was older. So is that them adjusting their mind? Did they adjust it because to them it didn't really look old enough? And they said that right from the beginning, or did they think about it and their mind started playing tricks saying he was older than that? And all of a sudden they decided that they needed to, age that sketch a little bit. And we even see it with Falk, Falk, same thing. Here's a guy that didn't report anything on the night of the Stein shooting, but then later on, after stuff's appearing in the newspaper, on the day stuff's appearing in the newspaper, he's writing his infamous memo saying what he saw after it's in the newspaper. So I just don't trust stuff that's added after the fact. I want to go with people's freshest memory, right when it happens, right when it's documented. And to me, that's usually the most honest and accurate account. And later on, when their mind starts playing tricks with them, they start second guessing themselves. That's when things you see start to change. And that's, I think, I don't always think they're doing it on purpose. I think their mind's just playing tricks with them a lot of times, and they're adding things, changing things. And in reality, their best first impression that they give you is what I like to go by. So, when it comes to reports, eyewitnesses, any of that stuff, I like to go with what somebody says early on and not, something they say years later.
I just want to point out that you mentioned multiple times, and that's like that there are different members of law enforcement that did that. Different police officers or different members with a badge that have changed their stories in very important ways, whether it's withholding something, not reporting something immediately. You just mentioned Collins and Falk and how they have made a lot of wavering statements. They've also said some statements that I think should be highly debated. And, Collins even appeared in The Myth of the Zodiac Killer saying that we shouldn't be looking for somebody who resembles the composite sketch after the Stein murder. We should be looking for somebody who resembles the composite after the Lake Berryessa Boyer sighting, the one with the dark brown hair that's parted on the side and so on. And I mean, that's even just a very, very controversial opinion. But I just think that this goes to show that police officers, investigators, detectives, all of these people, they are only human, and they're also going to experience the same types of problems that the witnesses are going to be experiencing. Yes, their mind can play tricks on them. They suddenly connect the dots in an inappropriate way. They suddenly have a false memory. And to be fair, Morph, you must have had this experience at some point in your life, right? When all of a sudden you're just able to remember, no, wait, this happened, then that happened, and I just remembered this other event happened. Sure. I think that just adds to the point of how we are only human. We don't remember things perfectly. Sometimes a memory can be unlocked, and other times it can fade away and it can be distorted. And I think that the statements from law enforcement or withholding information, because the two examples that you brought up, Collins and Falk, would be people withholding information for a certain amount of time. I think that just goes to show that it's not a surprise that the Zodiac Killer was never caught.
Well, and it's an interesting point because I was talking with somebody not too long ago about an experience we had when we were teenagers, and we were both telling the story of what happened. And then it got to a certain part of the story, and both of us are giving different details of the same exact thing that happened. And we realized that we weren't sure between us if we were both wrong or one of us was wrong, but our stories started to change, which just goes to show you that there were two of us that experienced the same exact thing at the same time. But later on, our stories, years later, this is way after the fact, our stories didn't mesh. Not because one of us was lying. It just, things in our mind, when we look back on them, were just not the same as the other person. So are we both wrong? Is one of us wrong? I don't know. But, again, when you're relying on old stuff from these cases, and you have to go by what's documented to really, dive into the case and look at the clues. And if you start remembering, if you start going by what somebody remembers 50 years later that they never said ever before, you're on a wild goose chase. You can see that with multiple officers, as you mentioned, multiple witnesses. And again, not because they're doing it maybe to try and harm the case or, because they want attention, but sometimes their minds after so long just, they don't remember stuff accurately. And this case is the one where there's no living witness to what happened. We've got James Owen that sees two cars there, but there's no bodies around. Then 6 minutes later, you have Stella Borges there, who sees two bodies on the ground, and what happened in between, we have no idea to this day. So it is interesting, just the crime scene in general. And there's one other thing I wanted to talk about and sort of get your take on. And I've never believed there were two shooters, but if there were, this scenario seems to make it seem possible. But, if you look at all the shell casings, they were all grouped in one spot, except for one shell casing that was I forget how many feet away from the others, 27 feet or something like that, very far away from the other ones. So I've always wondered about that one shell casing where that shot, could it have ricocheted, bounced off the roof of the car and just flew that far? It's possible. But I've also wondered, could there have been a second shooter there, which I really don't believe. I think there's only one shooter. But could there have been second shooter standing way over there that fired some kind of warning shot, and the other person did the primary shooting with all the shell casings landing close to each other? What are your thoughts on that stray shell casing being so far away from the other ones?
Well, we do have to give credit to Thomas Henry Horn, the author of The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 and 69, who has perhaps been the loudest voice about the shell casing. And a big difference that I have with him is that I think a little bit more like you did, where it's like I don't just say immediately that there is one possible result and only one possible result. There's only one possible explanation for that shell casing. But he is all about how somebody exited the passenger side of the car that would have been next to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, not the driver's side, like what most people think, because he has this explanation that there were multiple people in the car and that there was just a shot that was fired from someone who exited the passenger side, perhaps as a warning shot, or maybe he was trying to directly shoot at David and Betty Lou. And that's why the shell casing exited so far away from the driver's side or from the concentration of the other shell casing. Now, I mean, I guess I would perhaps say I am 80% that this was one single shooter, 20% that there could have been 20% that there could have been a second shooter. I do not think that it's impossible. And I think you laid it out in a very good way, because there still is a chance that there were multiple participants at the Lake Herman Road murders. It's still not beyond belief. We also have to remember, as you have already brought up, there are no eyewitness sightings of the killer or killers at Lake Herman Road. So multiple killers is a fair and reasonable possibility, where somebody could have exited the passenger side of the car, fired a shot, and walked around to David and Betty Lou. That is possible, but there are just so many other explanations as to how that shell casing could have been there. And I don't want to just insert participants into the story to make the narrative fit. And somebody wrote this out in the comment section on Black Box Online Radio just yesterday. That's like going on a journey, choosing the destination, and then just kind of like drawing your own lines on a map and saying, hey, I made a new road or something. This is the only road to the destination. Well, it's like you just drew that on yourself. You just made all those twists and turns yourself, and that's not even a real road. So I think that that's how a lot of people approach these types of situations. They have an idea, they have the Zodiac killer, they make their own twisted explanation as to how their idea, their theory, their suspect is the Zodiac killer, or their theory on the Zodiac killer case, which could involve multiple killers. But I mean, I think the simplest explanation is the Zodiac drove up next to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Perhaps he held his gun in the air and fired the warning shot. So that's why the shell casing went out, bounced off the roof or the windshield or something, some part of his own car, and that rolled to its location. That's why you have the shell casing so far away. Giving credit to Drew Gray, whom you've mentioned already in this episode, he talked about one on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique about how maybe that was done by the gravel being kicked about, because the Zodiac would have driven away from the scene and it was a gravel parking lot, and gravel doesn't stay in place. The gravel could have pushed the shell casing to that location, especially somebody who might be trying to leave in a hurry. I think that's another reasonable possibility. But I think all of this evidence can be explained by a single killer who targeted David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen for either some unknown reason or just simply because the Zodiac killer wanted to commit murder that night.
Yeah, and it's interesting, definitely, when you look at the evidence and you can theorize. We don't know what happened, but we can sort of theorize what happened. I think what you laid out makes the most sense to me is that Zodiac pulls up, gets out of his car. Maybe Dave senses something's wrong. He puts his car in gear, and Zodiac fires that warning shot. He's standing facing Dave's car, and the shell casing is going to bounce backwards and possibly ricochet off his own windshield. Then if he walks around and orders them out through Dave's side and then maybe comes around to the passenger side, now he's facing a different direction, shooting at Dave and then shooting at Betty. She's running. That's why you have the shell casing, because he's now facing a totally different direction than he was when he first fired that warning shot. To me, that makes the most sense, but it is always important to weigh the possibilities. And I mentioned earlier, this was a crime scene that the police weren't used to seeing, and not like this, not a motiveless killing that they could never find a motive for. So they weren't used to handling it. But I remember Russ Butterback, I contacted his daughter trying to contact him, and I didn't know that he had passed away at the time. And I talked to his daughter a little bit. She was the one that let me know that he brought home a bullet to keep as a souvenir from the crime scene. I was like, okay, that's not,
Wow.
That's not, I've sort of kept that. I've sort of told this story before, but I didn't really, because I didn't want to cast a bad light on him. He seemed like a really nice guy and just wasn't used to, dealing with a case like this. But according to his daughter, he did bring home a bullet from the crime scene as a souvenir. Now, she said bullet. I don't know if that meant casing or an actual bullet. But from what I recall, she said the word bullet. And years later, when I was trying to get the police to compare in Alameda County murders that happened there in 1967 to Lake Herman Road, they reached out to them, but the bullet that they had was too damaged to compare ballistically. So I always wondered what condition was the bullet, if it was a bullet that Russ Butterback had, and I always wonder what happened to that bullet, and where is it today? I don't know.
Okay, though, I would like to also give a shout out to Joe Kennedy, who wrote the book Solving Cold Cases. And I was recently exposed to his material this year. And one thing from one of his presentations was that when you're trying to solve a murder, you have to ask yourself the question, who is at the crime scene that doesn't belong? And when I was trying to incorporate that type of thinking into the Zodiac killer's murders, I really found that it's a big explanation as to how the Zodiac killer did not get captured. Because when you look at the Lake Herman Road murders, well, who's at the crime scene that doesn't belong there? For me, it's just the Zodiac. Everybody else has a reason to be there. For example, like you brought up the people like who are driving to work or someone who is driving home. Any motorist on the road might have a reasonable explanation as to why they are there. Raccoon hunters in the area are raccoon hunting, right? The only person that I think is completely out of place is the Zodiac. The same for Blue Rock Springs, the same for Lake Berryessa, and the same for the Stein murder. I really think that this goes to show that these were not crimes that had a very strong connection between the killer and the targeted victim. I think that this is more about how the Zodiac was trying to commit blitz-style attacks Mostly, not always. But he was doing this in a way in which he was choosing the victims at random and in obscure places, in places where he expected that he wouldn't be able to be caught. He had getaway strategies planned out. I'm not completely sure the Zodiac was extremely meticulous, or as meticulous as people think that he was, but I definitely think he was cold, methodical, and calculating. And that's how he was able to avoid the police. It's like he's going to sneak up on some teenagers at Lake Herman Road, fire some gunshots, get in his car, and drive away and hope that nobody saw him. I mean, that would simply be just, okay, I think the coast is clear. I'm going to shoot these kids, and then I'm going to get back in my car and drive away. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because, again, going back to James Owen for a second, we know James Owen drives by that car scene, that scene, and it's debatable whether it's 13 seconds later, as Owen claims, we're out on the road, or it's a minute later, or whatever the situation. Zodiac was there someplace, hiding in his car, wherever, behind the car. He had to be there because the second car was there, according to James Owen. So for him to be reckless enough to still go through with this crime, knowing that a car just drove by, he doesn't know if that person saw his license plate or could give a description of his car or whatever. He doesn't know what James Owen saw. But yet he still decided to go through with this crime, I think is pretty telling. I think it just shows that he was hell bent on doing this. No, even though he could have been caught. And that witness that just drove by may have been able to help provide details. Instead of aborting the mission, he still goes through with it. So I thought that was interesting in the fact that, he was hell bent on making this happen that night. And another interesting thing you sort of touched on, for being a dark and desolate road that not many people use, there was a lot of people on that road that night, and they were able to get a lot of them, the Yours, the raccoon hunters. They were able to document a lot of the people that were on that road in that area that night and get their statements and do a good job putting that timeline together. And to me, this is not a well-traveled road. This is not someplace where an out-of-towner is going to know that way out on this back road in the middle of nowhere you can find somebody there. To me, I knew this. I think this is somebody that knew that area was like a lover's lane, a couple's area where they had a chance of finding somebody out there. And, I think Zodiac, whoever he was, knew about this spot. So to me, it gives me a little clue that Zodiac most likely didn't find this place by accident. He knew that area was there and that he might find a couple there, and he knew to check it. Same goes for, Blue Rock Springs. He knew that area was there that people sometimes parked at, and that's why he found it. So that, Lake Herman Road with Blue Rock Springs, finding those two spots that were frequented by young couples, to me, that screams some of that was in Vallejo.
All right, but what do you think about the stuff that I said at the beginning about the Killing for Sport book? Because earlier this year, I was reading two books roughly at the same time, which is something I do a lot. One of them was called Killing for Sport by Pat Brown, and the other was called I, the Creation of a Serial Killer, which is mostly about the happy face killer, Keith Jesperson. And it talked about how before committing his first murder, the victim just said something to him that just triggered him, and he saw red, but he didn't commit the murder immediately. It just, at that moment, he knew that he was going to commit the murder, and the murder happens several hours later, if I recall correctly. But then with Killing for Sport, talking about how the first murder is not something that is extremely planned out, and then the second crime is done to recreate the first crime, and the third crime is done to establish a pattern or some type of persona. When I was reading those two things side by side, of course, I thought of the Zodiac killer. That is it possible that something just set him off that night when he was perhaps going to Lake Herman Road to commit murder? I absolutely think he went to Lake Herman Road to commit murder. But do you think this is the type of killer that was just sitting back for 5 years waiting? I'm going to be a serial killer one day, and I'm going to shoot people at random, and I'm going to create the Zodiac persona? Or do you think this is someone who had a really bad day on December 20th of 1968 and then just decided someone's going to die tonight? And for a very long time, I thought it was the first, someone who had just been thinking about murder for 5 years or 6 years, however long it may be. And then that was just the night that they chose to just do it. But then I guess over the last 7 months, I veered toward the second option where somebody was just set off and something made them want to go out and commit murder that night. What do you think?
I think it really depends who you ask as to what they tell you with that question, because to me, my thinking is, and it's never changed, I've always felt this, that the Zodiac was a lonely person that was not capable of being with someone. And here you have the holidays. If someone's lonely and the holidays are here, there are a lot of people commit violent acts during the holiday season, or they take their own lives with suicide during the holiday season. So for this to happen during the holidays, it could have been somebody was thinking about this and it was eating at them. And then maybe they got to the point where maybe, I don't know, they said, I'm going to become a serial killer, but maybe they got to the point where they were disturbed and they started thinking, these couples need to pay. They're having this happy time that I can't have. It's the holidays. And, I'm going to find a couple and I'm going to cause them some pain, like the pain I'm feeling of being lonely. That's what I want to bestow on this couple. That's my take. I've always thought that. Um, and I've felt, Lee Meller did a profile, for example, on my suspect, William McDuff, Andrew, and he sort of backed that up, that he thought Zodiac, whoever he was sort of in that mold of somebody that was lonely. And like I said, during the holidays is the time where a lot of people are lonely and they self-harm, they harm other people. It's just a time that a lot of pain comes to the surface, and interesting, the more I dig into this case, the more I find, well, I just mentioned my suspect. I found out recently that he had come home from college that weekend. That was a huge thing for me. All of a sudden he comes home from college and this murder happens. So to me, that was just one more check in the box for my suspect on a personal level. But since he sort of fit that thing of a lonely person that had nobody during the holidays, he comes home. He obviously knows this area because he's lived in Vallejo all his life. To me, that screams that he could have done this. So no matter who Zodiac is, I think my feeling is that he was a lonely person that didn't fit in, and the holidays, for whatever reason, was the last straw, and they chose at this time to do it. And then, I think they stewed on it. They thought about it over the next 7 months and said, I want to do that again. And maybe they fought it for a little bit and maybe they couldn't fight it anymore. Maybe they fantasized, hey, I'll be like some hero and I'll send letters to the police to mess with them and I'll get attention that way. The attention I never got in my everyday life, I'm going to get now through this cat and mouse game with the police. That's what I think Zodiac was. I think if he's ever identified, my gut feeling is that's what we're going to find out about him. But there's other people that will tell you something else. There's other people that will tell you, in their opinion, he knew all the victims somehow, and he was just checking them off one at a time off his kill list. And then there's other people that might say, like you just mentioned, he just had a really bad day and crossed paths with them, and maybe he pulled in to ask Dave for a cigarette or something, and Dave told him to screw off, and he lost it at that moment. I think whoever you ask is going to have a different answer for Zodiac's, first kill, or for that killing in particular at Lake Herman Road.
Well, that's really interesting that you say all those things because there are a couple responses that I have. So I'm going to try and like organize them a little bit. And as people know on Zodiac Monday, I'm not someone who goes gung ho for any suspect. As of now, I do not have a Zodiac suspect, but I used to do all of that. Read about the different suspect profiles and think, okay, this guy is my Zodiac killer suspect. This is the one that makes the most sense to me. Therefore, I think this person was the Zodiac killer. And believe it or not, one of the suspects that I had that connection with was Louis Myers. And Louis Myers was an extremely young Zodiac killer suspect. He was 17 years old at the time. And the reason why, though, was because of what you just said about how Randy Kenny, the person who came forward with Myers as a suspect, talked about how Louis Myers was a classmate of Betty Lou Jensen, the female victim at Lake Herman Road. And he worked with Darlene Ferrin at her restaurant. She was a server and he was a busboy. And he had these types of connections to the female victims. And that just made so much sense to me that he knew them personally. He knew these women and, he wanted to be with them and he couldn't, or he is just some type of frustrated teenager. And that's why he committed the murders. The men were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they were in his way. The concept of killing the man to get to the female victim. And it was also an explanation on how the Zodiac killer was not caught. Everybody's thinking that the Zodiac has to be some type of 30-year-old man or 40-year-old man, when in reality, they were all duped by a teenager. And I just had that light bulb aha moment. This makes sense to me. Do I stand by any of that now? No, absolutely not. Because that's just, like what I said, looking at the starting point, looking at the destination, drawing your own road on the map and saying that this is the only way to get there, even though it's a completely fictitious or imaginary road that you've drawn yourself. That's what that is. The second thing that I have for you, Mort, is something that I think is a little bit bigger because this is something that I stood by for a very long time. I mean, for a couple of years, I thought that this was the significance and meaning of the Lake Herman Road murders. As many people know, I've looked at a lot of the similarities between the Zodiac Killer case and the Jack the Ripper case. Not only do I do Zodiac Monday on Black Box Online Radio, I also do a segment called Ripper Wednesday, where I talk about Jack the Ripper. And when I first began looking into Jack the Ripper, I was shocked about all of these similarities between the Zodiac's crimes and Jack the Ripper crimes. For example, there are 5 canonical victims, and also there are the letters that are written, letters that are containing misspellings. So many things are similar, but there is a possible Ripper crime that took place on December 20th of 1888, and that's the murder of Rose Mylett. And I thought that the Zodiac was just someone who was stealing things from Jack the Ripper, who trying to recreate things from Jack the Ripper, paying homage to Jack the Ripper with all of his crimes in some way, somehow. After the Lake Berryessa stabbing, a message is written on the car door. After the third night in Ripper activity, a message is written on a building called the Goulston Street Graffito. And the Ripper mailed in a portion of a kidney from a victim, and the Zodiac mailed in a portion of Paul Stein's bloody shirt that was taken from the backside of his clothing. And there's just so many things that stood out to me. And I still might do this. I still might just write all of these down and document the similarities between Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac. But December 20th, I mean, once I learned about the murder of Rose Mylett, I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, this didn't seem like a coincidence to me at the time. And I even went on Ross Geraci's channel, Planet X Filmworks, talking about all of this, about how I think the Zodiac wanted to commit a murder on December 20th of 1968 because of the influences of Jack the Ripper. He's not going to choose August 31st, the date of the murder of Polly Nichols, Jack the Ripper's first crime. That would be too obvious. But very few people would ever think to look for December 20th because it's an unconfirmed Ripper story. And then I read the books that I was just talking to you about, Killing for Sport, Night, a creation of a serial killer. And that showed me that there could be different criminological and psychological reasons why the Zodiac was operating. I mean, we're talking like 1 week after I went public with all of those things on Planet X Filmworks, I found contradictory information, and I had to be like, wait a second, these might be better explanations. Maybe this is just someone who committed a murder, and he did so because of his own traumatic past. Maybe it wasn't done directly to show any type of recognition for the murder of Rose Milet. So, in fact, I might even say I was wrong about that.
And it doesn't hurt to explore those possible things because we don't know what influenced the Zodiac, and to look at different possibilities. You never know if you're going to find something that is worth pursuing. And there were some Zodiac like references, or there were some Ripper like references from Zodiac along the way. So maybe he was inspired to some extent by him. That's the interesting thing with this case is we see little tidbits and clues about what might have inspired Zodiac, but we don't know for sure if that's just a, part of what inspired him, or what. But so, I mean, here we are, half a decade. It's just crazy, mind boggling how much time's gone by, that it's 56 years since this double murder, and it's still unsolved. And I don't know at this point, it seems like if there was clear evidence that would have solved it, it seems like it would have been solved already. So I'm a little bit worried that there's not evidence in the Lake Herman Road file enough there to solve it. Maybe not in the whole case overall, but I'm curious, what are your closing thoughts on this case, and how hopeful are you that we'll one day know who killed David and Betty?
Now, wait a second, though. I have something that I have to bring up with you first. Now, Morph, you remember that I used to host the show Interview with the Experts on the Zodiac Killer channel, and our second guest was Mike Morford, you, of course. And when I interviewed you there, you said that you thought the Zodiac Killer mystery would have been solved in about 2 or 3 years. Do you remember saying that?
I did. I do remember.
And what do you think about that now?
Well, I'm worried about that, because the longer that goes by without it being solved, it's worrisome. Here's the wild card that we don't know about. We don't know what evidence the police have to work with behind the scenes. We just don't know. So do they have something and they're holding off on testing it because of any number of reasons? Did they test it and the results aren't good? We've heard dribs and drabs of what's being done behind the scene secondhand from people like Tom Voigt, but nothing official. So we don't know what they're doing. I can say this: if they had a clear DNA profile from Zodiac that they knew 100% was him, and they had a full profile, genealogy could have been done by now. And the fact it's not tells me a couple of things. Maybe they don't have that. Maybe they haven't even tried because they're short on funding and man hours. And I hate to say it, but California's got a lot of fresh crimes they've got to solve. And I don't think 50-year-old, 60-year-old cold cases are first on their list. I think they're trying to solve the cases that happened last week. And when you're shorthanded, you don't have the funds, you're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. You're going to go after the easiest case to solve, which is the one from last week where you've got fresh witnesses and fresh evidence, as opposed to trying to solve something from 50 or 60 years ago. So that being said, if they could do genealogy and they had a full profile and that was that simple, I think we'd have an answer by now. So the fact that it's dragging on either tells me it's dragging on because they don't have the evidence they need, or they don't have the funding and the man hours and the stuff they need to get it done. One reason or another, it's concerning. But I don't think we should give hope either, because checking the evidence out again, looking at it with fresh eyes, things that were tested 5 years ago for DNA should be tested again, because DNA advancements have come so far in the last 5 years. What they could do now versus what they could do 5 years ago is night and day difference. So they should look at all the evidence again, see if there's anything that they missed. They can solve cases now. They can get full DNA profiles sometimes with rootless hairs. So I'm thinking in this case, someplace along the way, there's a hair that they have in evidence someplace. You think Zodiac would have lost a hair some way along the way in an envelope or a letter or whatever. you'd think there would be a rootless hair someplace along the way that they might be able to get a profile from. But again, I don't know if the police have tried this, if they're even aware of it, if they're just too hung up on fresh cases. They're very secretive about what they're doing or not doing, and I just don't know. So it's hard for me to be confident that the case is going to be solved still when more time is passing and we're not getting answers.
Well, I also want to be very clear. I am not someone who enjoys the chase. I do want these mysteries to be solved, whether it's Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac, or the D.B. Cooper case, which is another one that I follow on Black Box Online Radio. But I am less and less optimistic that any of these cases will be solved. With the Zodiac Killer mystery, I'm very hopeful. The Zodiac Killer could have an ending like the Golden State Killer case. I do think that's possible, where it's just cold for years and then all of a sudden we have this amazing true crime breakthrough. But also, we can look at other true crime stories like the Long Island serial killer mystery, where the suspect has been most likely identified. I guess I'm a little bit optimistic and a little hopeful that the Zodiac Killer case will be solved, including the Lake Herman Road murders. But I'm less and less optimistic because true crime cases can turn into cold cases that are similar to Jack the Ripper, where it just goes on for hundreds of years and we will never know the truth. And I think it's going in that direction unless there is some type of major breakthrough in the true crime world.
Yeah, and to me, even if we can solve pieces of the Zodiac mystery, like if the Sherry Joe Bates case could be solved, or the Domingos Edwards case, or Ray Davis, if any of these other cases that are Zodiac adjacent could be solved and definitively linked or separated from the Zodiac case, it would just make the mystery that a little bit less mysterious if we could say, okay, these 2 or 3 cases have been solved and they're not Zodiac related. This person had nothing to do with the Zodiac case. We could shrink this mystery down a little bit, and focus on the cases that are definitely connected and the evidence that are in each of those cases. But I hope that pieces of the Zodiac case can be solved, if not the whole case.
Right, and I think that the Sherry Joe Bates case has a high chance of being solved because there's so much physical evidence. And here's another thing that's different between the Zodiac and other true crime cases. The Zodiac didn't leave behind a lot of physical evidence. I mean, the person who murdered Sherry Joe Bates got into a very physical encounter with her where there's all types of DNA that's left behind. We're talking about stuff like a watch band being broken and on the ground, if that is indeed the killer's DNA that's on there. But no matter what, Sherry Joe Bates fought her attacker up close and personal. And the Zodiac didn't do a lot of those things. The Zodiac put measures in place to avoid the personal confrontation. That means that less evidence was left behind. Some people think that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he had some type of law enforcement background. I don't know if there's sufficient evidence to support that. If anything, I think the Zodiac committed the crimes the way he did because of practicality, convenience, and the lack of desire to be in those confrontations. He wanted to commit murders as opposed to getting into a fight where he would be punching someone in the face, because that was his personality, his nature, and the MO that he wanted to establish. But with the Zodiac crimes, like the Lake Herman Road murders, yes, shell casings have been left behind. Yes, there were also, as you said, the witness sightings of the car. There are pieces of evidence, but they aren't strong pieces of evidence. The same goes with the Blue Rock Springs shooting. The same with the Lake Berryessa stabbing. If anything, I think there is an enormous amount of evidence that has been left behind at the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and also after the murder of Paul Stein. The Zodiac may have left behind a partial fingerprint, as well as talking about how this new thing, there could have been sweat DNA that was left behind in the car. If they could somehow analyze that, there could be forensic breakthroughs. Forensic science is becoming more and more powerful, and that's absolutely amazing. But Morph, we have seen a lot of stories that have been revealed, and not only some of the famous cases that I've talked about, like the Golden State Killer and the Long Island serial killer. We also saw the murder of Nancy Benelak being solved, but again, that's done through DNA. And the remains of Donna Lass were found in 1986 and identified in 2023. There are so many true crime stories that are Zodiac adjacent that are either being solved or we're getting a very, very large amount of answers, such as in the Donna Lass case. So that gives me a lot of hope that certain elements of the Zodiac killer mystery could be solved. But the thing that I am becoming less optimistic about is, are we going to be able to put this case closed stamp or signature on the files and just say, yeah, this is the Zodiac killer. This is who he was. This is how you solve the Z13 cipher. That stuff, the neat little package conclusion. I am less and less optimistic that that will happen each day.
Yeah, I'm with you there in the fact that, you know, it's a challenge, obviously, but we do get hope from these older cases that are being solved. So hopefully there's something here. And again, if we can solve, you know, the Lake Herman Road portion, if we can figure out who committed that crime, then we could say, okay, could they have committed the other Zodiac crimes? Then we know we have one person, and it's not somehow somebody that just knew about the police reports and, you know, a whole conspiracy like that. And so I hope time reveals the answers and reveals the evidence, and that we're not here doing another anniversary show in 5 years because it's still unsolved. Hopefully we do get some answers. So just one more time before we head out, let listeners know again where they can find you, what you're going to be talking about, and how they can catch you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on Zodiac Speaking. My name is Ned Tahan, and I am the host of Black Box Online Radio, which comes out on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can get it on Spotify under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. There's also a Facebook page for Black Box Online Radio, and I use the Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram and TikTok, and there are hundreds of reels and shorts that have been released about different true crime stories, mostly focusing on serial killers. And this year, I've also been a regular panelist on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. There was even a segment called Let's Talk with Ned that explored different true crime stories about other cases. And I invite you to go over to Mysteries with Mr. Belgique and check those out if you're curious. And that channel also has a regular panel discussion segment about the Zodiac killer. And of course, you know, I mean, Zodiac Speaking is a great podcast that I've appeared on a couple times. We talked about the Donna Lass case as well as about a recent Zodiac killer documentary that came out. And more, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure as always. You know, happy holidays. And to our listeners, again, Rich couldn't be with us. He was sick. We're sending him best wishes for the holidays. I hope he's feeling good for 2025. And, you know, listeners have written in and sent messages saying, hey, we missed the show. We want you to come back, even if it's just having different guests on and talking about different subject matter. So I think we're going to aim to do that. We're going to try and make this a more regular thing with new releases coming out here in 2025. So stay tuned, stay subscribed, and we will be back with new content. And to everybody, enjoy your holidays. We'll see you in 2025.
All right, and thank you, Morph. And one more time, we can say rest in peace to David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, and all of the victims that we've been discussing in this episode.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.